Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the Ripple Effect podcast. Today's guest is an 18-year-old climate activist, Priyanka Lala, who's been involved in climate advocacy from the age of 10. She is also a UNICEF youth advocate. Thank you so much for joining me here today, Priyanka. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you got involved in climate advocacy at such a young age?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me, Anna-Lise. It's an honor to be here speaking with you. My advocacy journey began at the age of 10, and it happened after Hurricanes Irma and Maria hit the Leeward Islands. I saw the devastation and the destruction on television, and I was wondering what my life would look like if I was one of those kids. And so I talked to my mom about it and realized that this was climate change and the large issue at hand. And so I did some research, and I realized that along with this, there were so many solutions out there that were being created and innovated to adapt to the issue. And so I did some research, and I started a zero waste blog and a zero waste lunch kit initiative, because I realized that if I wanted to see the action out there, I couldn't go around asking other people to adapt and to mitigate, but I had to lead by example and initiate it myself. And so I started with those initiatives at school, and I transitioned it to social media where I could express these initiatives to a larger audience. And I just continued with my climate advocacy, and I realized that it was much more than just an environmental issue, but it was a humanitarian crisis, and it was really linked to everything that we do and every industry around us.
Definitely. And I think you're such a great example of be the change you wish to see. You know, we always speak about all these issues, but you're actually living it. You're actually taking action. And from such a young age, that is so commendable.
Thank you.
So you talked about Hurricane Irma and how you saw that devastation.
Yeah.
Could you tell me a little bit about the different ways that climate change is affecting Trinidad and Tobago, but also other islands in our region?
Absolutely. Well, when it comes to small island developing states around the world, whether it's in the Caribbean or Pacific Islands, we're uniquely affected by the climate crisis because of our geographical position, because of our resources, and just our general disposition, our infrastructure. And so when we look at that, we are often affected with coastal erosion, with flash flooding, and we see it on a daily basis. Even with the heat, with the flash floods, after just 20 minutes of rain, we see it. And I think oftentimes when we look at climate change, it's presented as an environmental issue, a scientific issue. Even in primary school, I was taught that, okay, it's the changing precipitation patterns and the world is getting hotter. But then there's a disconnect, because what does that mean for us as humans? And
exactly.
what's the connection between why that's happening and why I should care?
Yeah.
And the reasoning is that it's more than that. It's a humanitarian crisis. It's infringing on human rights and child rights. And we're seeing it in every aspect. We're seeing it on a daily basis. Even here in Trinidad and Tobago, I often give the example when we have that annual flash flooding, the same exact communities, the same marginalized groups are washed out every year. They lose their homes, their belongings. The children are forced out of the education system because they no longer have schools, or perhaps their families don't have the finances to buy new uniforms, books, school supplies. And then that accounts for them being forced into child labor, perhaps, or even child marriages to support that family. And this is not seen as the climate crisis. It's seen as a separate issue. And that's a daunting place to be at, because we need to really close that gap and see that climate change is not disconnected from us, because it's a lived experience and it's something that we're feeling and we're seeing every day.
I totally agree. And I think from an athlete's perspective, you know, you always hear people say, is climate change real? But I can tell you it's very real. It affects when I train, when I'm able to train. The sun has become almost unbearable. It used to be a 10 a.m. cap when I could go outside and run. Now it's 7 a.m. because it's just that hot. And a lot of our sporting activities take place outside as well. We have CPL going on right now. A lot of it takes place at night, but imagine if it gets hotter and hotter, these things get pushed back, and eventually it might get to a point where we have to move everything indoors.
Absolutely.
And I think that is a way that we could get people to realize and care how climate change is affecting not just our environment, but our daily activities, our culture, our way of life.
Absolutely.
And touching on that aspect of sport and how it interacts with sustainability, you had mentioned to me that that was a topic that you had spoken about before.
Yes.
Would you like to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, exactly what you just touched on. Sport is a huge part of our culture. We see it in cricket, the boat racing, football, everything that we do. And likewise, there's a duality between sport. We are victims, but we're also contributors to the climate crisis in that aspect. We see it with the players being affected by sport, as you mentioned. There's also the impact that it has on the fields and the playing grounds. And then that impacts what equipment you need, what time of day you play.
Yeah.
And then there's also the flip side of it where you see the immense amounts of plastic pollution at stadiums after matches and the impact that the carbon emissions have when it's globally. And so there's that dual relationship. And I think that's really important to recognize, because when we're looking at the action and the mitigation strategies, it needs to reflect that. We need all players, all stakeholders part of it, our athletes, our sponsors, our team managers, the fans, everybody has a role to play. And I think oftentimes when we think of climate adaptation, we think, oh, big policies, infrastructure, governments need to come in. But aside from that, we as individuals have an important role to play, and we can't forget that. So at a sports game, know how you can input a sustainable part, know what you can do. And I think just that small steps add up to great impact. And that's something that we need to remember.
Yes, 100%, 100%. And again, I think there's another duality between sport and sustainability. From myself as an athlete, partaking in sport took me to partake in hiking, which got me involved in the environment quite a lot. It got me able to see parts of Trinidad that I never got to see before, and I just fell in love with it. I fell in love with the nature of our island. And because of that, I feel this immense need to protect it. And I think that that's something that sport does as well. I mean, yes, we are victims, we are contributors, but I think it also plays a part in helping us become stewards for the environment, because outside is where we spend our time partaking in sport. And I think that there's another aspect where sport is intertwined with the environment itself. I know from my own perspective as someone who does a lot of hiking. Because of that, I got to experience our natural environment. I got to see a lot of different parts of Trinidad, our beautiful nature, and that allowed me to fall in love with it and to appreciate it. And I think that athletes have a unique appreciation for the environment. We saw it very obviously in the Olympic Games when we had our triathletes who could not swim in the River Seine because it was just so polluted. But so it has that really significant impact where we, as you said quite rightly, we are victims, but we can also be contributors as well. So what do you think are some of the different ways that we can combat against climate change within Trinidad, not just on a national level, but maybe on a personal level? You know, we have viewers who might feel like, I don't have that much power over making these large changes. What are some things that maybe they could do?
Absolutely. Well, to that point, I actually did a focus group 2 years ago, and it was students my age, 16, maybe 15. And the question was, do you believe that you can have an impact in climate action, climate adaptation? And 98% said no. They don't think they can because the major companies, the organizations, they have the power. And while that's true to an extent, I think we often forget the power we have as individuals and how important that is, because ultimately we are the consumers and we determine the markets. We determine what those producers essentially put out. And I think when it comes to individual strategies, it's really important to look at things like zero waste living. Some of my initiatives like Eat Green, Live Blue, which I created during the pandemic, which was just simply planting home gardens and kitchen gardens when we saw the issues of food insecurity, looking at how we can eat better. And that's also a huge aspect for athletes as well, that ensuring that their diets are better and also linking that to climate change and how we can manage food security while also looking at the impacts of carbon emissions. And I think on a larger scale as well, climate education is something that really needs to be focused on, starting at primary school levels and taking it all the way up to tertiary education, really teaching our kids the values that come along with climate change. I think not only the scientific aspects, but also why we need to care. This is our home, this is our earth, and we have the responsibility. We have the right to a healthy environment, but we have the responsibility to uphold that right. And I think even on an international level, as you mentioned, we have some things like Stop Ecocide International. They're an organization working towards criminalizing environmental degradation. And that's something that we should look at bringing to our region and to our country, because ultimately we need that support of the legislation to enforce. But with that, we also need to recognize accountability and transparency and ensure that it's really enforced. Because, for example, we have the styrofoam ban, but is it really enforced? Ultimately, not necessarily. And we've talked about it so much, but still we see the immense amounts of plastic pollution. So I think there's a responsibility there as well.
Yeah, so I think you said that quite nicely. You know, everything is intertwined, everything is interconnected. You know, as we get people more involved in sports, we have them more aware of the environment, more environmentally conscious, and aware of how that climate change is affecting their daily activities and their way of life. Absolutely. But then it has that knock-on effect of they now are more conscious of their physical health and what they eat and what they put into their bodies. And actually, as you touched on food consumption, specifically beef and cows, that is a huge impact to climate change. Yeah. And as athletes, we have to be very aware of having varied diets and knowing where our food comes from. So I think, it really is all intertwined, and there are small things that we can do as individuals, but there are also larger things that those who are in power, that they can start with and really enforce. Absolutely. Like the styrofoam ban, because I'm still seeing a lot of plastic everywhere.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Priyanka. That was super informative. I think our viewers learned quite a lot about how important it is to care for the environment, as well as small changes that we can make as individuals to make a positive impact.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll be speaking with an Olympic athlete about the importance of sports and how it has influenced his appreciation for the environment. See you next week.